house had been standing for nearly a century, weathered by time and forgotten by the world. It was a 2-story structure with peeling white paint, warped wooden floors, and a roof that groaned under the weight of years. The windows, veiled in dust, allowed only slivers of moonlight to cut through the perpetual gloom inside. Daniel Morgan had inherited it from his late uncle, a man he barely remembered. With nowhere else to go and a desire to escape his suffocating city life, he moved in, thinking he could turn the old house into something livable. The first night was uneventful. The air smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. The wind howled through the trees outside, making the windows rattle in their frames. He convinced himself that the strange noises were just the house settling. But then, the footsteps started. It was always the same. Just past midnight, a slow, deliberate thump, 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 echoed from the attic above his bedroom. The sound was rhythmic, patient, too deliberate to be the creaks of an old house. The first time, he dismissed it. The second time, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to find a logical explanation. The third time, he couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was walking in the attic. Days passed and the footsteps continued, never failing to start at the stroke of midnight. No matter how late he stayed up, they would come. If he dared to move, the sound would stop, as if it knew he was listening. It wasn't just noise anymore. The air in the house felt wrong. The shadows stretched too long in the dim light. The walls seemed to absorb sound, muting everything except the creaking above him. Each morning, he would convince himself it was nothing. He told himself he was tired, stressed, imagining things. But by nightfall, his confidence would wane, and the silence before midnight became unbearable. And then, one night, he made his decision. He would go up to the attic. Daniel lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Midnight approached. His hands were clenched into fists, his breath slow and measured. Tonight, he would go up. The attic door was at the end of the hallway, a square wooden hatch with a metal pull handle. He had never opened it before. In fact, he hadn't even thought about it until the footsteps began. His phone's clock blinked 12 a.m. Right on cue, the sound started. Thump, thump, thump. The steady rhythm of something pacing directly above him. The same deliberate, patient gait. No rush, no hesitation. Daniel swallowed hard and swung his legs over the side of the bed. The floor groaned under his weight as he stepped forward. He was painfully aware of how loud each breath sounded in the silence. He reached the attic door, heart hammering in his chest. The footsteps hadn't stopped. Whoever or whatever was up there hadn't heard him. Gripping the handle, he pulled. The attic hatch was heavier than he expected, resisting for a moment before creaking open. A wave of dust and cold, stale air rolled down, making him cough. A wooden ladder unfolded before him, stretching into the dark void above. Daniel hesitated. The footsteps had stopped. The air felt heavier, as if the house itself was waiting, listening. With a deep breath, he climbed the ladder. The attic was suffocatingly dark. The beam of his flashlight cut through thick dust, revealing wooden beams, old furniture covered in white sheets, and a floor blanketed in dirt. The air smelled of mildew and something faintly rotten. Daniel's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He slowly moved the flashlight across the space. Nothing. No footprints in the dust. No signs of movement. No hidden doors or eerie artifacts. Just an attic. His breath caught in his throat. Then what had been making the noise? He forced himself to walk forward, the wooden floor bending slightly under his weight. The dust curled around his feet with each step. Nothing. He exhaled, letting out a nervous laugh. Maybe it really had been the house settling. Maybe his mind had twisted the noises into something they weren't. But just as he turned to leave, he noticed something. At the far end of the attic, beneath the slanted roof, there was a single wooden chair. Unlike the rest of the furniture, it wasn't covered in a sheet. The dust around it was disturbed, as if someone had been sitting there. Daniel took a step forward, his stomach tightening. A single handprint was smeared across the back of the chair. The print wasn't old. It wasn't faded. It was fresh. And it was too large to be his. His throat tightened. The attic was silent, oppressively so. He could hear his own heartbeat, the dry rasp of his breathing. He needed to leave. Daniel turned back toward the ladder. But something was wrong. The dust on the floor near the entrance had changed. When he'd first entered, his own footprints had been the only disturbance. But now, there were more. They trailed from the ladder to the chair, and then back to where he was standing. His blood turned ice. Someone had been up here, with him, very recently. Panic seized him. He lunged toward the ladder, descending in frantic, unsteady movements. As soon as his feet hit the hallway floor, he slammed the attic door shut and locked it. His breath came in ragged gasps. The house was silent again. No footsteps, no sounds. But Daniel knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had not been alone in that attic. Morning brought no comfort. The memory of the attic lingered like a stain in his mind. He replayed every detail. The chair, the handprint, the footprints. None of it made sense. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone had been living up there, hiding. But that didn't explain the footsteps. He spent the day trying to rationalize what he had seen. He checked every door and window, all locked. He searched for hidden entrances, none. He even tried to convince himself he had imagined it, but the unease gnawed at him. He avoided the attic for the rest of the day. But as night fell, a familiar dread returned. And when the clock struck midnight, thump, 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 Daniel shot up in bed. His breath caught in his throat. Number. He had checked the attic. It had been empty. There was nothing up there. Then, what was making the sound? He gripped the edge of his blanket, body frozen in place. The footsteps continued, slow, patient, pacing the attic. But then, something changed. For the first time in all these nights, the footsteps did not stay above him. They began moving. Daniel's blood ran cold. The slow, measured steps traveled from the attic toward the hallway. Then, a soft creak. The attic door moved. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, heart pounding. He told himself it wasn't real, that he was imagining things. Then, creak, creak, creak. The footsteps were no longer in the attic. They were in the hallway, moving toward his room. Daniel stopped breathing. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing down on him like unseen hands. The only sound was the slow, deliberate steps. Closer, closer. Then, silence. The air was heavy with expectation, thick with something unseen. And then, just as he dared to open his eyes, a single breath, right behind him. Daniel's body locked in place. Every muscle screamed for him to move, to run, to do anything, but he couldn't. The breath behind him was slow, deliberate, like the exhale of something waiting. The air had shifted. It wasn't just cold anymore. It was heavy, thick with something wrong. A sensation slithered over his skin, the unshakable awareness that he was not alone. He was being watched. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. His lungs ached as he forced himself to stay still, heart hammering against his ribs. The silence stretched, unbearable. Then, a whisper. Not words, not a voice, just the sound of something close. Too close. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. He didn't want to turn. Couldn't. Every primal instinct screamed at him. Don't look, don't acknowledge it, don't give it power. But then the footsteps returned. Thump, thump, thump. Not walking away, moving around him. Daniel's breath hitched. The sound circled his bed, slow and deliberate. The floor groaned with each step. It was pacing, studying him. The air grew colder. He felt a pressure, as if the very walls were closing in, trapping him inside. Then, just as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped, right at his bedside. His skin crawled, his stomach churned. He knew that if he opened his eyes, he would see something that should not be there. A shape, a shadow, a figure standing over him, waiting for him to move, to react, to acknowledge its presence. The silence was unbearable. And then, a hand touched his shoulder. Daniel screamed. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. He lunged from the bed, nearly tripping as he scrambled toward the door. His hands fumbled at the handle, yanking it open with a force that sent him stumbling into the hallway. The house was wrong. The shadows seemed deeper, twisting unnaturally in the dim light. The walls loomed closer, suffocating, like the house itself was alive and watching. He didn't stop. He ran, nearly falling down the stairs as he threw himself toward the front door. His fingers trembled as he fought with the lock. Behind him, footsteps, not slow anymore, faster, closer. Daniel's pulse roared in his ears as he finally tore the door open, throwing himself into the freezing night. His bare feet hit the cold grass as he sprinted down the driveway. The wind howled, bitter and sharp against his skin. He didn't stop until he reached the road. Only then did he dare to turn around. The house stood in eerie stillness, its broken shutters rattling in the wind. The door hung open, darkness spilling from inside. But nothing followed him. No figure, no shadow, no sign of whatever had been in that room with him. Just an empty doorway, waiting, watching. Daniel never went back inside. At dawn, he returned with the police. They searched the house, moving through each room with careful professional detachment. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry. No footprints in the attic. No evidence of anyone else ever being there. The house was empty, except the attic door was open. The ladder was down, and in the thick layer of dust on the attic floor, there was a single wooden chair facing the hatch, waiting. Daniel left that day. He never stepped foot in the house again. He didn't sell it, didn't rent it. He simply left it behind, an abandoned relic of something unnamed. But the house remained, and at night when the wind howled through the empty halls, something still walked in the attic, waiting for someone to listen, waiting for someone to come back.